3, 2. Hey, Tim, how are you?
I'm doing very fine, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. You know, I enjoyed myself so much last meeting. I'm glad we decided to continue on with human-centered design. Um, and then you were starting to tell me a story about your great grandma and how this all fit in. Can you continue on with that now that we've actually connected with our
Oh
with our
yeah.
yeah,
Oh
go
yeah.
ahead.
And it's not my great grandmother. It's my great great grandmother,
Oh,
which is
okay.
even better. She was a widow of the Civil War, and she and her husband were in Branson, Missouri, and we have the grants from who was it? It was Buchanan, President Buchanan, that actually gave them the land grants in there, right? And she had 7 sons. And after the Civil War, of course, Missouri was the South. And so she said, go forth and prosper and find a place where the Jerome clan can set up shop. And the 7 brothers went different directions, but they all went down into Boise Valley. Now, my grandfather was one of 3 sets of twins. And then my great grandfather was one of the sons of this great great grandmother. Okay. Now, my dad was the oldest of his generation of the kids. And by that time, they had like 100 Jeromes in that community, right? It was amazing over 2 or 3 generations how these families can grow. Now, here's the story. My dad, because he was the oldest, he was tasked with driving great great grandma around, and he'd often have to drive her from her church activities home at night. And he'd get mad because he was driving. You know how the headlights shine in your eyes?
Mhm.
And she saw him get flustered, and she said, Donnie, don't do that. Don't let them disturb you. Whenever the lights are coming by, that's the way they're going to behave. This is the way humans are. Understand, people are not going to put their brights off. Just watch the side of the road until they go by, and it won't burn the lights in your eyes. You won't lose your night vision. Fine. My dad learned a great lesson that day. Not only, number one, do I not stare at bright lights at night, but number two, if I expect people to behave and be polite, I'm probably not be really nice. Now, what does this have to do with human-centeredness? Human-centeredness means designing and behaving with people around me in mind. And by teaching this to my dad, she was teaching keeping your, not just your team and your work and your projects with the human focus, but your very actions and your day-to-day activities.
That's interesting, and I can relate to that because I grew up in the country myself on a farm. And that's exactly the experience. But there, it was very important to keep your eyes on the side of the road because there was a huge ditch on the side of the road that if you weren't paying attention, that's where you would end up. So her wisdom was credible indeed from my experience.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. You and I, it's funny how you and I grew up in similar environments. You and I grew into the same industry. Now, within that industry, we went totally different directions.
Yeah.
But out of that, we have almost identical perceptions and opinions.
Well, and certainly a lot of our experiences lended themselves to what we're talking about every single week on these podcasts. So that's an exciting thing that you're right. We had, you took one branch of IT, I took a different branch in IT, but yet we coalesced on some of the same observations.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And it all boils down to, and I'm willing to say this, okay? I'll stick my neck out because it's not going too far. It's because we have operated and engaged in our work in one common denominator: humans,
Yeah.
with humans and human behavior in mind.
So if I can put in a shameless plug here, when I retired, that's why I named my company, my consulting single shingle company, People First Project Management LLC. So
Yeah,
it all comes down to humans
yeah,
and people first.
and it would be really neat to start exploring and defining what we're finding out is a hallmark of good project management, which could be potentially called human-centered project management.
Yeah, and I was gonna look at that. I want to define that again for our listeners, especially for those who missed last week's podcast and who want to go back to that. But last week, I thought we focused a little more on designing human-centered design for the end user. And I think the example I used was something along the lines of designing, say, a pair of scissors for a left-handed person. Today, I think we want to take the approach of being the design team who is designing that pair of scissors for the left-handed person. But what do we do within our team to be human-centered? Is that fair?
Right,
Okay.
exactly. How do I design the work and the environment for my team so it's easy for them to work together? And how do I design the project and the communications and the interaction for my stakeholders so it's easy for them to contribute, collaborate, and understand what we're doing?
What's interesting to me is I could not put that into words last week. I think when I went back and listened, I think I fumbled around for about 3 minutes to get something like that. And it just came clear to me as I was trying to make sure that we have that definition. And we're going to center our discussion today around that definition.
Right.
There? Yeah.
Correct.
So in terms of, I think what we talked about, one of the questions that we had been kind of playing with, I know when we had an earlier meeting this week, was in terms of the human-centered design as we focus on leadership and keeping the leadership aspects in mind and how that changes our approach, say, to working with people in general or just, just ordinary processes during the day. Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm sure you do.
Yes. If I were to take a human-centered approach, like you and I are discussing, number one, I do it in consideration of the people and their unique experiences. Okay. I'm understanding how they go about their day-to-day. I understand the office environment. I understand the business. I understand people, and as individuals and as a group, how they behave and operate. Number two, we start getting into this whole space of what we know as formal leadership, which means self-awareness and emotional intelligence. Those are the hallmarks of good servant leadership.
Well, and part of what you're also talking about, and I've been a paid for consultant for many, many years. When I'm dealing with my team, I think I like what you just said. When I'm dealing with my team, my IT team comes with their experiences and their predispositions. However, I also have a stakeholder constituency called my end user or my client base, who have a completely different view of what a project looks like. So me as the leader then must set myself up in such a way that I can deal with both sets, bring them together, and show the human-centeredness for all of them. Fair?
Yes, and this is what's great. Number one, we already understand leadership and servant leadership and the value.
Yeah.
Number two, we're playing with human-centered design and that whole concept. Now, human-centered design started in product development and software development. And we can go back and talk about Norman and the development of the statement, and the phrase, right? If we actually can get those two to meet in the middle, number one, I can use early development and how human-centered design has developed for product and service development and servant leadership, and they can actually leverage off the strengths of each other.
Well, they can, and for those people who have heard past podcasts of ours, they've probably heard me in one or two of them say something along the lines of, when I worked in IT with an IT team, I made sure my IT practitioners weren't just all about the software and the process. They their instructions were to learn the client's business as well as the client knows their own business. Because in that way, they could then, as they're dealing with the software, the bits and bytes and the ands and ors, as they dealt with logic, they could still deal with the illogic of a lot of our clients' processes in their requirements. So they, as you were saying, the two come together. But I think we as leaders have to put ourselves out there in such a way that we earn the trust and we earn the knowledge of those we're trying to serve or those we are serving.
It's very interesting. You're talking about the team and leading them with how they work and behave. And you're talking about clients and how they work and behave, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like how we have to adopt a culture when we go to another country. It's the same thing. We have to get into their mindset. We can't expect them to learn our language. We have to adopt the way they work.
But think about that. When you and I grew up certainly when I grew up in this industry, very young in the industry, we expected our users to understand what we did. And when they didn't, we just said, you know what, you go over there, sit in the corner, we'll develop the system for you, and then you can use the system we developed for you. I mean, we were arrogant in our approach to how we develop systems back then, or at least the people I worked with certainly were. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and it was the same thing with me. And not only that, but we come to it through good reason, because not only do we have, this is making my job hard, I want to make it easier, but also how do I do it within expectations of the schedule? I can't have the interaction with my stakeholders because they had too many unknowns, and I have to have my team follow exactly this, or we're going to go over budget. And there's no way for me to actually, balance out this dilemma unless I have 150% control.
Well, that's true. And part of how we used to assume that control, much different now in today's age, but how we used to assume that control was right up front. We would kind of lay out the rules of the engagement, because in a predictive, which is my experience, in a predictive process, when you've got a fixed endpoint, you need to be able to have that control. And so therefore we would kind of lay that out up front and say, Mr. Client, we're going to give you the system you want, but you need to abide by the rules and the timeliness of what we're doing. So in some ways, we were upfront about it, but in some ways we were still a little autocratic.
Yeah, and let's not get it wrong. There's still place for autocracy in projects and project management today. Working with the federal government, you're going to do it that way because it's the law. Working with nuclear material, working with dangerous chemicals, and working with people's lives. You have to have that. And there is a time and place for that autocracy. But at the same point, if we really want things to run smoothly, where we can and when we can, applying this understanding of humans and human behavior can make it not just easy, but somewhat fulfilling and satisfying.
Yeah, and I can think now, even in one of my advisory capacities recently, we were in a requirements definition session, and it's an agile project, so we were in the middle of a sprint, and part of the requirements definition, there was a certain word placed on the screen, on a notice that would have been sent out to the client's users, their constituents. And that it was a very long, difficult English word that a lot of people didn't use. And so I piped up and I said, should we change that word to something a little more English? Because I know the population you serve, and many, many, many of them have English as a second language. They will not understand what you're telling them in that notice. And they did, they changed the word. And I'm thinking, why hasn't that come up before? It's because people weren't thinking completely human-centeredly in previous applications.
There was a rocket scientist who was actually the youngest rocket scientist at the end of World War II, who was working with von Neumann, who would pat you on the back, Richard Feynman. And Feynman was well known for doing exactly what you're talking about. In fact, there's a technique, if you look over on Wikipedia, that says, here's how you learn how to describe things so people can easily understand them. Now, again, it takes extra effort from our part, and it takes time, and it takes a lot of practice, but it's effective, it makes it easy, and we're often much more successful.
Well, and if I were a young project manager breaking into my first project management exercise, this would be one of those pieces of advice that I've just received from two old guys that I will absolutely take within myself. Because when I'm in IT, it's so easy to go into IT conversation with my user, and then they don't want to look stupid, so they don't say, I don't understand. So
yeah, and actually Agile takes this into consideration. There's something called an XP, or an extreme programming metaphor. And the whole story behind an XP metaphor is you don't define the work based on how engineers think about how the work fits. You design the work based on how the work works within the users. The users get to name the pieces of work, not the engineers.
Yeah, they get to, that's right. They get to name them in their vernacular, not in ours.
And you know what? All of a sudden, number one, stakeholders understand what's going on. And number two, engineers start thinking like stakeholders. And
So,
just go ahead.
no, go ahead, you finish.
And just by making this one little change, like bringing in tools and tricks like XP metaphors and Feynman technique, we're naturally getting people, we're not having to tell them, they're easily transforming their mindset to think like the end user and think like other people.
So I'm going to go back to something you started with when we were talking about the definition of this.
Yes.
So again, we're talking about leadership, our process, keeping in mind how our teams work and how they behave. And that should be changing the way we interact with our team, correct?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're talking about now, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly where this is leading us.
Yeah.
It's a whole different way. And I try to describe this to students as a mindset. It's not a set of tools. It's not habits and behaviors. It's thinking from a different perspective. It's setting aside your opinions and perceptions, and that's hard. But then actually being observant, listening actively, and understanding from the eyes, ears, and perceptions of other people. This is not easy.
Well, it's not easy. And what the other sort of wrench that gets thrown into this is the fact that it's one thing to be dealing with the team as a whole, but it's another thing to be working with the individuals within that team, because a team is comprised of individuals, all of whom have different views and different attitudes and different demeanors and different days that they woke up on the wrong side of the bed and those sorts of things. So I think what we're talking about also is not just in terms of how we change our behavior towards the team, but how we change our behavior toward each individual within that team, meaning then we have to get to know each individual within our team.
Yeah, and we talk about this in my classes. This is, you raise a really good point. One of the things that we find is if you take like somebody who does something wrong every day, day in and day out, okay? And you can fix that in one of two ways. Number one, you can tell them they're wrong and say, don't do that, and say, if I find you doing it again, I'm going to have to punish you. Okay. We use coercion here, or we can approach it from that different, experience of the individual and use curiosity. And if you're using curiosity, number one, they don't put up their guards because you're not attacking them. But you're understanding and learning about them, and they may not understand what they're doing too. So it's a really good opportunity. Now, it takes time. It takes understanding humans in, fundamentally, and it takes a lot of understanding of specific humans. You can't do this right off the bat. You have to be around somebody for 6 or 7 weeks to do this well.
You do. And I tell you, when I was a younger project manager, I used to use that excuse in my own mind. This takes time. I don't have time to do that. I don't have time to take that individual aside. And what I found was over the years, had I taken the time up front, I would have saved much time during the process, because in not dealing with the situation early enough, it ended up kind of contributing and expanding and exploiting other areas within that, such that we ended up losing more time than had I just taken care of it right up front.
Yeah, and think about it this way. I was in Civil Air Patrol when I was a young teenager, and we go out on day hikes for practice and for emergency preparedness and training, right? And we'd be up and down and up and down. The boys would be all over the place. And the platoon leader at that time was about 30 to 35. And he'd be humming to himself and watching, make sure nobody gets in trouble. And he was so efficient with the use of his body. And we were exhausted and miserable while we were making dinner, while he was animated and having fun. And he tried to point this out to us. And he said, guys, I've been watching you and you're wearing yourselves out. What are you doing here? And he was understanding of humans enough to a point that he knew that we had to experience this wearing out and being grumpy during dinner a few times before we started learning how to walk and hike and do all of our work in an efficient manner.
So again, it took time.
Yeah.
Took time up front.
But you know what? That is time well spent, because
Yep.
you spend it once. It's like everything else. You spend it once, and then it has impacts time over time over time over time over time. Pays off in dividends.
So the other thing I'm hearing, or at least I'm gathering from our discussion, is that it starts with us. It starts with us as leaders. If we're going to inculcate those kinds of behaviors within our teams, and even if we're going to understand our teams, it does start with us. So even while we're managing the schedule and managing the different personalities, and we still have to take that time to be real people to our people.
Yes, and we have to do the upfront homework.
Yeah.
Early in a project, we can't expect people to come to us with a worksheet that says, this is my behavior, this is my Myers-Briggs, this is my weaknesses. No, it doesn't work that way. We do the homework. We, establish this. Hopefully, there are teachable moments where we can actually help our team understand the value of doing this and interacting in this way. But for the most part, it's us doing the work first. You're right.
Well, it's interesting what you were just saying, because one of my clients once asked me to help them put together a decision-making process based on my experience with other clients, similar clients to them. And I said, as often, and this may be my problem, I don't know, but as often as I've helped clients put together a decision-making process, for whatever reason, it just got put on the shelf. It became shelf help, not self-help. And people ended up doing what they needed to do, what worked fine. So yeah, you can have processes and bubbles and diamonds for decisions, but until you've actually sat down and taken every circumstance at its face value, it's difficult to put a single process onto every kind of decision you need to make.
Yeah, it's like those old martial arts movies. You can buy those little tiny paper magazines that says become a martial arts master by following this, or you can go out and do the actions and work and make mistakes and mistakes and do it and refine it.
So last year we did a couple, I think, podcasts on servant leadership, and what I'm hearing also from you and from this discussion is that this is a lot like being a servant leader.
It is. It is. I was looking at that too. Yeah, there like we said earlier, there's components of self-awareness, knowing myself and knowing other people are like me, right? Knowing the mechanics of being a human being, but also emotional intelligence and understanding relationships and how my emotions and triggers work. Now, what's really cool is I found the earliest reference about 6 months ago to servant leader in publication. Okay. And we started talking about this in our books in 1970. Listen to this definition and see if it looks like human-centeredness. Okay. The servant who, by acting with integrity and spirit, builds trust and lifts people up and helps them grow, and the leader who is trusted and shapes others' destinies by going out and showing the way. Now, you do not do that without understanding others and without having understanding what their destiny is and what their direction and what their intention and focus is.
Well, and you don't do that without understanding yourself.
Yes.
So the whole idea of self-awareness, I think that came out very strongly in that definition. The whole understanding of self-awareness, the idea of emotional intelligence, which again, when I started my career, was bred out of us. Mm-hmm. We were all about facts, figures, Gantt charts, get it done, timeline, right? And there wasn't a lot of time for niceties and human nice. And you're sick, take the day off and get in here. You got to work Saturday too. I mean, there was just, it was not a pleasant experience, but that's kind of how we ran projects in the 1970s and 80s.
But that's the way business was done in the 1970s and 80s. And that was the model, right? You have work to do and you accommodate the people, you shape the people for the work. And now what we're learning is if we understand how people naturally behave, we shape the work that needs to get done around that understanding. Now, as a leader, it seems that servant leadership does this the best. Humans are going to act like humans. They're going to naturally do these things. They're going to be curious. They're going to make mistakes. And so why don't we build this into the way we work?
Well, and let me give you a couple examples, even from my experience. And then I'm going to give you a little quiz, which I think you'll get quickly. When I was in one project working, there was an ultimatum or an edict. You will be in at 8. You will not leave before 5. You will not leave before your task is complete. That was project 1. Project 2 recognized that some people were morning people. Some people were evening people. Some people like to work at 2 or 3 in the morning. That project manager decided that the best way to do was to set up core hours. We need to have core hours between 10 and 3, get all of our interactions done between 10 and 3, and then the rest of the time is yours as long as you get the job done. Which do you think had the better team collaboration and cohesion?
Oh, better collaboration, better cohesion when you consider that flexibility. Number 2, probably
yes,
greater
absolutely.
engagement and greater productivity. I have results of years of surveys that demonstrate this, not just tell about people's opinions.
But think about it. So when I first started, I was instructed, I had to be in work at 8 a.m. period. That was us. All of us had to be there. And we would be fretting if we're caught in traffic. I mean, you're sitting there. And so by the time you got to work and opened your computer, turned it on, you were already frustrated and flustered. And how do you think the rest of the day would go? So all of a sudden this other project manager, years later, this other project manager enters human-centeredness into the equation, understanding how each person works, brings them together. And what an incredible experience all of those people had.
Now, if I give my team a little sense of control, if I give my team a sense of flexibility and a little bit of fulfillment because they're able to do work in the way they want to. I'm creating something called engagement,
Yes.
which all of a sudden improves productivity, improves customer ratings, eliminates defects, creates higher sales, higher profitability. And here's the secret, okay? Gallup polls from 2005 through today have constantly demonstrated we have, as managers, 70% of the control over the engagement of workers. And workers only have 30% of control over their personal engagement. So guess whose fault it is if work is not happening? It's ours.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Absolutely. So
Yeah.
we've been, I'm sorry, I have a tickle today. We have been kind of talking on the team side. Why don't we flip the equation a little bit to talk about our clients? Because after all, we're in IT to serve our clients, whether we are an internal IT shop serving the users of our same company, or a for-hire IT shop doing projects on behalf of a client. We still have clients. We still have constituency. Can we
You know,
flip this equation to them?
yeah, and this is what always was a struggle for me. If my client was the investor, if they were paying me to do work, it should be their results, not mine. Yeah, I'm the technical expert, but they're going to have to live with the results. And if they're not happy, my job and my paycheck is on the line. So why shouldn't I start with at least trying to understand what stakeholders truly need? Not what I can engineer, but what can they need?
So have you had think about some of your experiences. Can you shed some light on perhaps things that you did in some projects to make it easier for the project to go forward based on how you anticipated or how you brought the client's needs in?
Actually, there were two.
Ah,
Number one, I had a supervisor director of a healthcare environment in California in 2005. And he said, I'm the director of one of three organizations, and we're looking to automate IT. And we need a technical solution that allows us to easily push patches and upgrades. Okay, great. We can engineer that. Actually, talking with him over the next 2 weeks, that wasn't his problem. This guy's problem was his two friends were getting fired. And he's going to triple his workload. If I can get a client to tell me what the real problem is, number one, I can shape the solution to speak to what their real human needs are, not a technical innovation, but
yeah.
a real solution of a human problem. And that's what I'm looking for. And every consultant aspires to solve problems, not provide a technical, innovation.
In my experience, similar to that, my modus operandi was to anticipate. Because quite often, you get into a situation with a client, and let's say I'm working with a senior stakeholder from the client side, which I often did. They didn't understand projects. Now, they were very valuable to us in terms of motivating their teams and removing roadblocks from their side, but they weren't project people. So there were a lot of times that I could look ahead and see what was coming, and they couldn't. And so I would say, let's prepare for this. And they'd give me a quizzical look like, let's prepare for the fact that the feds are going to ask you as an example, the feds are going to ask you for a report that looks like this. Really? Yes. So I would prepare the dummy report for them. Sure enough, the feds would call and say, hey, we need a report that does this. And they'd fill in the blanks and send it off. And they'd go, wow, how did you know that? And here's the clue. I anticipated, but they were the hero.
Yes, yes. You made it easy. You made it easy for number one, them to look successful. And number two, for them to get out of a problem that they didn't even know they were going to be in a couple weeks.
Exactly. And that happened over and over. And here's what happened from my career, from my perspective, from my career perspective, is they began to trust me more and more. So I had deputy directors of major departments were beginning to trust me more and more in terms of the value I brought to their project, but also the fact that I was looking out for their needs, not for my own. And several times I told them that my job was to work myself out of a job. They couldn't believe that because so many of their consultants had figured out ways to stay on.
Yes. I followed a lot of the big eights around. And a lot of the strategy of the big eight is not to have a relationship, but to actually get a desk and a chair inside the company so that they could generate revenue. And it was really weird to have this re-education and this level setting with clients. I had the same experience, and that was our superpower. That was our super strength.
I remember one of the big eights, that a lot of them had, I don't know if they still do or not. And they're not 8 anymore. I think they're much smaller. But I remember, I think one of the philosophies was up or out. Mm-hmm. And one of the companies they said up or out. But what they did was they had trained this person that was about to go out. They trained him so well that even though they didn't fit their organization anymore, they would be very valuable inside a client organization that they were trying to get an engagement with. And often they would figure out a way to put that person into a decision-making capacity in that, in the client shop. And then certainly the engagements would come back to them. So in some ways, I was very strategic on their behalf, on their part.
Yeah, and you can't fault them. That's constant cash flow. And once you have that, then you can start talking about estimating and forecasting profitability. That's good business. But on the other hand, it's doing it, based on I'm solving my problems, and I'm not necessarily solving the problems of the corporation. And that gets into dangerous territory.
It does. Yeah, absolutely. You talked earlier about, I can't remember exactly the phrasing you used, but let me ask you the question this way. How would we go about, say, changing a staff member or even a client person who are, and I'll use the word misbehaving, although that's probably an incorrect word, but who are not necessarily contributing in the way they should be? How can we apply some of these human-centered leadership approaches to a person that's struggling in that way?
First of all, constant habit of assessment. Okay. Number one, you have to understand, what work is going out and what expected work should be getting done. You have to understand the mechanics and how mature the team is right now. Are they forming, norming, storming, performing? What's the health? And what's the normal interaction day to day of the team? And then you can start focusing in on the individual. That's where you say, number one, are they engaged? Are they plugged in? Are they demonstrating, care about their results? Are they demonstrating, that they can have enough discipline to tell themselves to get to work? And then you can also look at, are they contributing? Are they contributing through emails? Are they there? And it's these little tiny signals. You can create a checklist that you just go bing, bing, bing when you're having a cup of coffee with somebody. Or if you do this enough years, it sort of becomes natural behavior that you just have this ongoing collection of information, and you don't know that you're doing this, but you're doing this constant assessment. Is the work of the project going well? Is the team functioning well? And are the people plugged into the team and the work?
And sometimes what you can do is just, what I've done is I've gently nudged them with a question and an email or something, just not in an accusatory way, right. Not in a way that says you're not performing, but just nudge them in a way that says, "Ooh, I better get this done." Or I better.
Yeah, and depending on the gravity of the behavior or the actions or the results, Does it have to be formal? Does it have to be informal? Can I do it over a cup of coffee? Can I just check in on them? Or do I need to have a one-on-one with them just to see where they are in their progress? And the thing is, you don't have to do it all. You can actually start teaching the team to self-govern too. It gets a little dangerous, but within limits, you can actually have the team self-govern, because some of us actually are much more successful under peer pressure than having authority come down.
I was just going to mention that because often, I may not like my boss for whatever reason, and I may, but I don't want to disappoint my team.
Yes,
I don't want
yes.
to. So often the peer pressure and you as a leader using human-centeredness, again, knowing your team, knowing the individuals, can just subtly plant a few things here and there such that the team comes to the conclusion that they didn't even realize you planted for them to come to that conclusion.
And what I discovered back in 2005 is this mindset works really well for remote workers. You don't have to have them clock in or clock out. You don't have to have them do this. All you have to do is check in on them, say, hey, how are things going? What do you need? Is everything going well? How's your work-life balance? And these are the things that are going to affect their productivity and their mindset. And understanding how people work, really, this is a really powerful force with remote workers.
Well, and what we're saying here, I think the two of us are both saying it's easier for us, or we can make it easier for people to do things the right way or to do right things, and make it more difficult for them to do things incorrectly or do them wrong.
That's the whole idea behind a team charter. You're establishing up front, you're proactive, and you're saying, guys, if you want to have an easy way of work, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to share information. We're going to make our meetings short. We're going to make them effective. We're going to focus in on this. Here's how we're going to make our decisions. Here's how we're going to use our values. And it's going to be easy for us to get work done.
Yeah, I mean, something just as easy as an action item list that you're preparing in the entire team's view with end dates. Imagine how that quickly changes behavior.
Well, and if you do this over 6 or 7 weeks, like team meetings, like a stand-up, right? Every morning, what did we get done yesterday? Where are we today? What are we doing tomorrow? What are the top 3 issues and risks? Okay, boom, 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 boom. And if you do that over 6 or 7 weeks, all of a sudden it becomes a habit. And whenever they walk into the meeting, they're ready with their list in the back of their mind. It's like, oh, I'm brushing my teeth. And I don't have to remind people if they do it every day.
Well, and particularly if they do bring up blockers during the meeting, and then you, as a result of them bringing up those blockers, you have someone on the team or yourself come to a solution within the next hours or days, then they can see that they need to be speaking up in these meetings. They need to be behaving correctly. They need to be informing their management and their fellow team members of what is slowing them down or potentially causing a problem.
Yeah, so this is not tricks. This is not little brass rings that we memorize and pull out at magic moments. This is just going through our days and using natural understanding of human behavior to make sure that people can actually get their work done easily.
And if I now switch again, as I did before, to my stakeholder team, my client team, I did exactly the same things that we're talking about with our internal team for their behalf as well, such that I made it easier for them to contribute their part of the project to the project, and we got things done much more collaboratively and much more quickly.
Yeah, man, I saw this a lot with data center transformation. When people were in the middle of messy data centers, or people knew that centralizing their corporate data and applications was going to be ugly, I saw this really early. And a lot of my early clients who had gone through decades of crashing and burning on these projects. They knew that you start this engagement with your stakeholders and setting these habits and establish these cultures 9 months in advance of these major changes. All of a sudden, it's like a natural progression. It's beautiful. It's like an orchestra that's just simply does what it does.
And I tell you, there is nothing more meaningful. Now we are working remotely. That's, to me, that's less meaningful. I like being around my team and my client, but there's nothing more meaningful than walking down the hallway and having someone pipe up from their cubicle and saying, "Hey, that thing you told me a couple of days ago, it worked." It helped
Yes.
me, and it helped me with my boss, or it helped me, something. But whatever works to keep the project moving forward in a very successful, positive manner. Just that's
Yeah, and even remotely, I'm really hooked on mentorship. I think one of the things that pulled me through the COVID blues was having 2 or 3 mentees at a time on a regular basis. And number one, brainstorming with them in real world problems, and number 2, having them come back and actually recognize me for my support. And this is a really big, I got to tell you, being a manager, being a project manager is a huge sacrifice in many ways. And this is one of the ways you can actually get rewarded for that sacrifice.
I'm laughing. I'm smiling, not at you, but at me, because I just happen to have retired from my from my consulting, my permanent consulting project process right before COVID hit, right before the pandemic hit. And so while you got through the COVID blues with mentees, I got through the COVID blues by getting up every morning and kissing the ground because I wasn't on an airplane every week.
Yeah, it did change things. It really did change things. And human behavior, though, it's funny. Humans and human behavior have not changed. And this is what I've sort of scratched my head. How do I manage people in office, and how do I manage people at home, working from home? And it's no different. The things I do to actually engage my team and engage my stakeholders. Now, the tools change, but the actions and activities I do don't, because humans don't change.
Yeah.
It's the tools we use to get the work done that changes.
Yeah, there's still something though. I'm in the middle of a user acceptance test process right now with one of my consulting engagements. And I love that's my favorite part of the project, user acceptance test. But what's my favorite part is when you've got all of your testers in one room with whiteboards and flip charts and everything, and you can stop breakout rooms. We tried different things, and it's difficult to get our end users sometimes really understanding the tools they need to use when we're not all together in one room. So yeah, the tools are different, but sometimes the process can be a little frustrating too with this.
I agree with you. I agree with you totally. So now let's think about this. What about ourselves? Can we also apply this human-centered mindset to our own daily actions and routines to make our jobs more understanding?
Boy, I believe we can. We talked earlier about the fact that we need to be able to have collaboration with our teams and have them be self-starting in some cases. Everything that we apply to our teams, we need to apply to ourselves first. So if we're going to respect our teams, we need to respect ourselves also. If we're going to tell our teams to take a day off and just relax and get your head engaged for tomorrow, we need to tell ourselves the same thing every once in a while. I think we need to treat ourselves as well as we want to treat our teams.
Well, and let me give you another one that's not so behavioral. It's actually functional. I've been playing with the idea of how can I eat a breakfast? Not have breakfast at noon or 1. For the last 10 months, my breakfasts have sort of pushed out to lunch and brunch. And it's frustrating me because I know that it messes with my ability to focus and stuff like this. And after listening to about 3 or 4 podcasts, why do I have to have a breakfast that consists of breakfast food? And why can't I just have a bunch of beans and green chili and an egg and broccoli and throw it in a bowl and eat that? And lo and behold, it takes me 15 minutes to put that together. I can eat it with enough time to prepare for my classes, and the whole day changes because the fuel I'm putting in is better fuel than what I thought breakfast was supposed to be.
Yeah, so a little bit of self-care. That's what
Yes,
you just,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And it changes everything. This is the thing. Human-centeredness does not necessarily, stop at the design of the product or service. It actually embraces all of human behavior. And if we can actually look at it from that way, we can use the science of human-centered design and apply it to all of human behaviors that we interact around and with, including ourselves.
Well, and going back to my initial premise, if I'm going to design those left-handed scissors for left-handed constituents, using a human-centered approach to the way I lead my teams, it all comes full circle. Because in working with them, we've got our, obviously, our constituents in mind, we've got ourselves in mind as well. And I, as their leader, need to be as engaged as they are so that we can help our eventual end user client.
Right, exactly. That's the beautiful thing. It's, I look at the value in the value statement of PMI all the time, the code of ethics. And when they say respect, one of the components that we respect is ourselves, and we are a stakeholder. And understanding that, all of a sudden, we give ourselves the same opportunity to grow and develop as we give the team and the stakeholders and the product.
Yeah, to thine own self be true, right? I mean, was that Shakespeare? That was somebody back then. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, a lot of people have said that, but at the same point, that's one of the big banners that you put in your human-centered design office. Be true, be honest with what the goal and the objective and the focus are.
Well, and I was you said put that in your office. I remember one user acceptance test process, one of my testers developed this huge sign, put it above the door. So every time you walked out the door, you'd see this. It wasn't to thine own self be true or be true. It said throughput. So I figured, I've probably gone too far. I've just created a project management nightmare out of this guy. Throughput.
That's great. That's great. So how do you, wrapping all this up, what do you think we have discovered here? I think we have a core understanding and a real paradigm shift on what we think of as human-centered design.
I think we do. I think in terms of just dealing with our teams, our clients, the people around us. Well, at one point you and I talked, this is probably a year ago or so, we talked also about our responsibilities in voluntary organizations with volunteers. So it doesn't change. So the whole idea of the human-centeredness, the treating people like they want to be treated, whether they're the people who take out our waste baskets at the end of the day, or whether the people that sign the front of our checks, it's all comes down to the human-centered relational aspects of what it is that we're doing in caring for them. And as we just talked about, in our own self-care.
Yeah. And what you said early in this show, in the first season, it may include soft skills, but this is not soft. There's nothing soft about it. This takes supreme effort. It doesn't take effort to learn how to do this. It takes effort to unlearn these perceptions and opinions we have of how to get work done inside the project environment.
Well, and especially project environments tend to be very time boxed, very time oriented. And when the pressure's on, people forget to be nice, but we can't forget to be nice. We can't forget to be people to our people. That's it.
I remember when you're saying that, I just remember my platoon commander and him just smiling and watching everybody else jump around, and while he was calmly and just easily walking through. It is, you're exactly right. It's taking that time to do it correctly.
Well, can I tell you, when I was younger too, and this will be my last story for the day, but when I was younger as a project manager, I thought the way you were a good project manager was work all day and work all night and just keep ahead of it at all times. And your boss would look at how hard you're working and the progress you're making. You know what I do now? The end of the day comes, I sit back, we have dinner with my family. Now it's a little colder here where we are right now. So I put a fire in the fireplace. I have an easy chair that sits back. I pull up some reading material and I just relax. And sometimes that just relax for an hour is worth 3 or 4 hours of continuous pounding on the project.
Oh, yes, indeed. I've experienced the same thing over the last, well, I had to learn about work-life balance back in 2015, 2016. So in the last 5 or 6 years, I've learned that wisdom of putting my cares away, and often putting my cares away and investing in this personal self-care magically creates the solution. It's like going to bed on a problem and waking up with the solution flashing in neon lights in front of you while you brush your teeth. This is the way humans work. And only by going through this experience a few times do we learn this.
Well, I don't know that we've exhausted this topic because there's so much to this topic, but I think in last week's and this week's podcast, I think we've done a pretty good coverage of the whole idea of human-centered design, or design from a human-centered approach.
Now, I'm really excited about where we're going forward in the future with these shows, because we've set a great foundation of a mindset and an understanding of leadership. We're at a point in our show, and also in a point in project management, where we can actually take this and start dissecting the various aspects of project management. And what do you know? Our next show is going to be show number 50. So awesome. So I'd like us to actually start talking about what our perspective of what project management is today and where do we think it's going.
So we want to be prognosticators. I'm willing to tackle this.
Let's actually be forecasters.
There you go.
We can still take benchmarks and assumptions, but we can actually do some analysis and see over the next few months and years if this actually does play out, because humans don't change, like you said, and it would be interesting to see how the human factor of this actually colors the path of project management.
Well, what's interesting too, and I don't know how much research you're doing into these things, but last night I had the privilege of being on a Zoom call with a person who's in the events industry. I think I've shared with you before that I'm part of the National Speakers Association. Mm-hmm. And someone from the events industry was giving us her forecasting of what was happening. And they do a lot of studies and graphing and watching what's going on. And just to understand how they're seeing the world of events and conferences and all that kind of stuff unfold. I think, I don't have necessarily a lot of access to some of that research, but I think if we could get hold of some of that research, we could also show what is in store for project management in the next 2 or 3 years.
I think I know where we can get that data, but
Good.
let's use that as part of our discussion. But as well, I think you and I have enough of an understanding of the history of project management and its velocity and its throughput to understand where it's going. And I think you and I putting our heads together can actually paint a good story too.
Good. I can't wait to hear what I have to say.
Yeah. So where can we find you if we have questions about what we talked about today and what we may be talking about in the next weeks and months ahead?
I like LinkedIn. Find me at Merv Jersyk at LinkedIn. And because not only then do we relate, but also other people that are connected to us can relate. So we can learn together.
Yes, yes. And the same with me for right now. As I expose my conversations and ideas across other social media outlets, I'll give my LinkedIn followers as well as this show followers the updates.
Excellent. So until then, we'll bid you goodbye.
Thanks again, Merv, and we'll look forward to you and our audience to talk.
Good.